what happened in the travel that brought you from the West Coast to the East Coast to establish yourself as the new Kehinde?
I don't think it was, well, it certainly wasn't conscious. There was no moment where I was now someone else. It was a moment of, oh shit, this is New York. You know, people are really different here. A lot of it was just being in a car all the time in LA. It was a very different relationship with the public. You're just in that car, you're in a capsule, you've got your NPR going, or whatever it is that you do. And then you step out into the world consciously. Whereas I'd become the artist in residence, amazing program. If you guys ever, look it up, it's the Studio Museum in Harlem. They have a great artist in residency program. 3 people a year chosen. I got it, right? And I was coming out of Yale, not knowing what to do with myself, sitting around, and I got the phone call saying that I was accepted, went to New York, and discovered that there was this radically vibrant public energy there. I moved to Harlem, and it was the first time that I had seen an African-American community of such visual specter. It was on 125th Street that the museum was, and every Saturday afternoon, I don't know if you recall this back then, because Harlem has changed a lot since, but you know, it was like you would see a music video one evening, and then by 3 days later, you'd see all those outfits on that street. And it was a great exercise in this kind of like very strong indexical relationship between the street and popular culture, between what's performed as yourself and what's beamed out there as a self to be had. And you know, none of this was conceptualized or put into such discrete packages back then, but it was just a lived life, and I wanted to sort of taste that and get into it and to sort of like know what that is in art. I remember going up to really beautiful people in the streets in what might be considered kind of like a creepy way, and saying like, look, can I paint you, please? And my studio being on 125th, it was really convenient. I would invite people, mostly young African-American men between the ages of, I don't know, whatever age I was, mostly in their 20s, to come in and to model for me. We would do very straight, from life paintings. And in those sittings, they would often look around and see that I had a lot of art history books and examples of my work hanging on the walls, and we'd begin these conversations about art, why it is that I do what I do, why would anyone spend all this time up here in this creepy little room making paintings, and what is it about portrait making that you like? And I would turn the table and I would say, you know, look through that book there and tell me which portraits in there you respond to and why. Because ultimately, I knew why I loved the history of art and a lot of the sort of grand narrative portraits that I was looking at. And eventually I started to take what they were saying to heart and allow them to have actually kind of the control of the painting, positioning themselves in the guise of the people that they were looking at. And it was a very small act in the beginning, but something clicked, and I realized that you know, this isn't, it wasn't about copying the old master paintings in the way that you would see in an art institution where you would copy the painting to learn how to paint. In this sense, we were kind of shadow dancing with this history, this kind of amazing, beautiful, and terrible history, and creating something that was an image of someone who was caught up in this moment, this instant moment in the streets where they meet this guy, and all of a sudden this art conversation starts. And so when I looked at that painting later on, I was staring not only at a portrait of an individual, a portrait of a young man, but I was staring at a portrait of myself in Harlem at that moment. I was staring at a portrait of the way that we as a society in many ways can't come to terms with a very dead and old art form. But I was also coming to terms with this urge to want to breathe life into something that I've had so much love for, which is painting.
There's a moment for you, I would imagine, when we move into the world stage, where Harlem is not enough. where those young men in that street is not enough. And so, in my opinion, this is where you decide to become the visual griot, where you decide to go and investigate black, brown on another land. How did that come about? What was it that you saw that made Harlem suddenly small again, that made you want to go out and take a look at the rest of the world? Can you explain that to us a bit?
Well, I like this idea that something made Harlem small again, because that's exactly what happened, and that's exactly what I recall, which is this sense that, okay, I'm now getting play for my work. I'm starting to get invited to do shows all over the world, and I'm meeting other artists. I'm seeing young people all over the world who are responding in their own ways to American culture, American popular culture, which is peopled by black Americans by and large, and hip hop becoming that sort of dominant media presence. And of course, going back to this idea that the hip hop that I had seen in Harlem and the black presence in Harlem that was so radically different from the sort of lived experience that I had in Los Angeles was palpably different. And so Harlem became this known quantity for me, but also something that was at once nameable, ineffable. And I started going around the world and seeing young Chinese kids, young Brazilian kids, Indian kids, listening to American culture, dressing in the way of hip hop, and consuming hip hop music and making their own works, but then peopling it with their own ideas. And hip hop had suddenly grown up in the sense that it had grown vast throughout the world. It hadn't necessarily lost its original DNA, which was this kind of cry of, this is wrong and you need to bear witness to this. I mean, that was basically what hip hop had done back in the 70s in the Bronx, but its precursors, jazz and the blues, they had all been around a really painful life and how to bring beauty to it. And the DNA surrounding that Transformation Act was now being sprinkled all over the world through a really efficient American media environment. And as a young artist, I was going around and seeing people deal with it and then spit it out in their own unique ways. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And I didn't want to find a way of bringing it back fully formed and say, well, great, look at this, or to like start some sort of blog or zine or some like device to engage it. I wanted to actually just sort of like be there and to allow my own practice to bear witness to what was happening around me. And it was frightening because I'd become so versed at how to deal with America, how to deal with street casting, for example. And you know, there's a way that you walk up to a complete stranger in New York and you kind of know what's going to happen. You know, it's like Paris Hilton has poisoned the population into thinking, like, of course, someone's going to come up to you and just add water. This moment of like presence is there, and just add water. Celebrity is expected all over the place, and so people just they're not flapped by it. But like oftentimes, when going into small villages in Africa, I remember feeling really almost like an oppressive force, walking up to people and asking them to participate in like a painting, because it wasn't just me, it was perhaps, you know, someone who was assisting me at the time. Oftentimes we would have a camera. I'd try to fumble through the books and give examples of the work, but there's, yeah, that's right. It's just like, well, I mean, you know, oftentimes that level of attention is associated with some sort of like police presence or like the force of the state, something like that. It's just not normal, and you just have, you know, you get out of there. And what I was trying to do was almost just the opposite of that. It was just to kind of like celebrate someone and embrace who they are, and you know, allow them to kind of participate in this project that I had created, and talk about how interesting it is that they found an ability to look so fly, given the realities of the world that we live in. You know? So it's interesting because I've been able to fashion, I think, a very nuanced approach to street casting by virtue of just the realities of life on the road.
There's a huge leap between, for instance, the boys of Dakar, the boys of India, and now the boys. Brazil was a bridge, but the boys in Israel, there was something beyond intellect for me, the boys in Israel. There was emotion, there was history, there was displacement and new homeness. There was a mixture of something that fascinates me is textile, but textile within the context of history and culture, and then embodied in a frame of blackness. This, for me, was the biggest leap that I had seen, and so I'd like to jump right now to the show that's upstairs, which, by the way, I think is extraordinary, and I do think that it has changed. And yet, you look at books now, and books of Kehinde Wiley, decorative men of color. But there's something about this set of young men. I don't know whether it's because you heard their stories better. They spoke to you in a different way. They showed you something of themselves that was emotional rather than, yes, I'll take the picture with you. Did you get to know them better? There was something about these guys that I find the nth degree.
Yeah, you're picking up on something, because I definitely feel like I walked into something there. You know, Israel there's a reason why a lot of contemporary artists don't work in Israel or work around Israel. You know, it's so easy to get mired into a much larger global political debate. And that's kind of why I walked into it, because I was kind of like, all right, well, let's push myself into some place that's like really uncomfortable, and maybe a surprise will come out of that, or maybe I'll be disarmed in many ways. And I think that's exactly what happened. Is you know, some of the realities to street casting weren't availed, so you had to find new ways of getting people together. So it would be meeting one key person, and then they would introduce me to a community of others. I actually met Kehinde Wiley, who's one of the models, one of the Ethiopian Jewish models in the show, an amazing musician, but also like a connector, and he's one of those people who's incredibly charismatic and was capable of like communicating what it is that I wanted to do in the work to everybody, and made it seem really fun. And quite honestly, the casting was a big party. I mean, he invited a bunch of people to the house, and we got a bunch of beers, and we had music going, and instruments came out. And originally, we just started shooting film, and it became a conversation more than anything. And I began talking to Kehinde about his life, about what it feels like to be in Israel as this peripheral, marginalized person, and I had all these like ways of framing this thing, and he was just like, "Cut the shit," you know, like this is amazing to be here. Like, can you imagine what it was like to be back in Ethiopia, and how many horrible things had happened? But at the same time, it's really fucked up to be here too. And I'm in this weird limbo space, so like I can't answer your discrete questions so easily. It's it is what it is, you know. And so we went on to have many more conversations with people. And one of the reasons why I included the film as part of the exhibition is because I felt like in this exhibition that the stories behind the work were begging to be included within the narrative of this as much as the paintings on the wall. Ultimately, there is no answer here. I'm not trying to create a show that gives you the big picture on 21st century Tel Aviv. What I'm giving you is a snapshot on a series of experiences that happened and ways of looking at some really fun people that I ran into at certain key moments in time. Some were in apartments, some were in dance clubs. I remember getting permission from the owners of some nightclubs to set up my lights and cameras in the back of places. And we actually had people, some drunk, some not, really curious about what we were up to, and those became moments where we could engage potential models. Ultimately, though, when I began doing research on these decorative fields that I oftentimes want to create in my paintings, I started to realize that the bloodlines that lead into and out of Israel are so rich and mixed and complex. You have a diaspora that goes everywhere from Asia Minor to North Africa to Eastern Europe. And you know, I started doing research on simple decorative fields, and I happened upon this paper cut tradition, which is just absolutely magical. I mean, it's this idea that you would have a piece of paper and by hand, you yourself create a devotional object that then gets placed in your home on a wall during moments of transformation, it be rites of birth, or marriage, or what have you. And you know, this. That's right. That's right. And I actually was able to find later on some of those same pieces in the Jewish Museum in New York when the work was displayed for the first time, and I was able to show them in situ with the original objects placed next to them. And I think it was a great opportunity to be able to see where this comes from. So much of the work is stuck in my head or stuck within a more conceptual framework. This was the actual object.
I think it's also wonderful as a reintroduction to the viewer because you're looking at these fairly powerful male figures, but this Mizrah cutout is predominantly done by women and children. So the family comes back into it in terms of male and female, gets reintroduced into your painting in a sort of through left field simply by the history of these cutouts.
Yeah, most of the decorative traditions, including Mizrah, were performed by women and children. You look at, you know, the history of decorative works from China to 19th century Europe, and you'll find that highly pointed decorative work is regarded as something that soothes the mind and allows for the irrational to be pulled away. It was, in a lot of Victorian writing, something that was seen as a way of cooling the irrational mind of women. And you'll see notice of things like extremely floral and decorative wallpapers as ways of keeping the mind from wandering too often. You find in literature moments like the yellow wallpaper, this notion of like insanity. At any rate, I'm sort of fascinated by like how really deep it gets in terms of this coding for the decorative and the feminine, and its control, and how you can kind of play with that in painting, kind of play with this hyperbolic machismo that gets built up and built up and built up and then seeded with different other vocabularies. it's kind of pulling the rug up underneath of it a little bit.
I think maybe we should actually just take a little bit of time to maybe speak about some of the paintings that are here that we'll see sort of beyond the young men that you met, but I know that they are various shades of not only black, brown, but they're also different religions and from different areas. So perhaps you can just give us an introduction of these types of young men.
Sure. The painting that you're looking at right now are comes out of a group of paintings that I made, some of which are in the show and some are not. There are a lot more paintings in the world than are actually in the museum. And so it was a painful process of sort of culling and trying to figure out which ones would make it. But they come from groups of friends. Kalkidan, who's here, was the ringleader for his community of friends. And so he kind of created a blast zone of his own. So from his group of people, there's the other group, which comes from the nightclubs. And so this is, with the last painting, it was from the nightclub scene. Mm-hmm. And you can tell, I think, a bit of that because of the lighting that comes out of it. We allowed some of the luminant light from that place to be the light that we use for the paintings. And then there's the Arab-Israeli paintings that we made in someone's front yard. And it was the best place to shoot because the power was being used from a generator, and so we were able to keep the noise and the smoke from getting all over the house. But yeah, it was kind of interesting to be able to paint all of these different types of people. But it's also an interesting game to figure out who is who. If you're not looking at name tags, or perhaps if you don't know this body of work as much, it might be more interesting to kind of figure out what that story is. You know, ethnically, there's a lot of spillage as well, and so to be able to look at someone and to name them as such is kind of troubling in many ways. How does that work when you've got olive-skinned people of many different hues, all sort of colliding in a series of paintings?
Did they have one specific thing that did glue them together? Was it simply the land of Israel? Was it a feeling of they were in limbo, perhaps? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
And I don't either. And so the thing is that there were so many different stories and so many different histories. And so as opposed to putting words into people's mouths, I actually went so far as to have the conversations presented in film form so that those words are out there and not sort of overspoken or misspoken. But their complexity is deep. I mean, there's some people who have parts of their family in Israel and parts of their family in contested territories. They have some Ethiopian families who have people back home in Ethiopia and people who are in their new homes. Whereas others are decidedly cosmopolitan, Ashkenazi citizens of Tel Aviv who are equally pictured in this group. And what you end up with is this kind of jumbled mix. Oftentimes, there's this assumption that an artist should sort of hold this in and sort of pull this in and almost create a politically nuanced view of the way to look at situations in countries that are in constant flux, such as the state of Israel. And in this body of work, I tried to be a little bit more systematic about removing myself from any kind of editorializing. I decided to have an open door policy to who wanted to jump into the frame when we were doing public street castings. When we were doing casting in bars and clubs, it was interesting because as opposed to ethnicity, the default was blood alcohol toxicity. And so we would end up with the most drunk people wanting to perform most.
It's kind of wild because it's sort of, what kind of artist does it make you? Are you griot indeed? Are you newspaper? Are you, I just want to paint, which is, for instance, I just make this comparison again. As an actor, I've had to be very specific about the types of roles that I play because my medium is so powerful. The television is so vast, people buy it right away. Oh yes, they're like that, they're like that.
Mm-hmm.
As a visual artist, where are you in the picture?
I
When
can't
you
do
are
that.
traveling the world
Yeah.
and somebody approaches a painting and sees what they see,
Yeah.
how do you become the artist again?
Mhm.
After you've heard the stories, after you've met the people,
Right.
and now I'm just going to do an interpretation.
Right, and I would even say an extrapolation as opposed to an interpretation. I try to create a system, a grid that I throw on top of new locations and allow for that grid to then reveal the contours of the location. It's impossible, it doesn't work that way. So what you end up doing is you try your best to walk into a place and get yourself out of it and try to allow the place to reveal itself, but you yourself are swayed by human emotion, by the realities of what's going on the ground. I don't want to necessarily have to decide what type of artist I want to be. I don't necessarily feel as though, this is something I suppose subscribed to years ago when dealing with this question around American blackness, which is that, should every utterance be politicized? Is it ever possible to simply paint a bowl of fruit without it being seen as a bowl of fruit painted by a gay, black, American male, right? And the answer is no. You're always going to be creating a bowl of fruit that's seen through a rubric. And so as opposed to crying about it, oftentimes I will paint the rubric. Oftentimes I'll try to make the most fabulous and fun version of that rubric possible. And in so doing, I'm revealing myself by painting the fucked up system that surrounds the ways in which myself is denied. I know it makes no sense at all, but it's at least an urge. And art at its best does more than point. Art, I think, in some ways tries to get to some of those urgent things that are these itches that need scratching, and a lot of mine have to do with just radical freedom, the freedom to simply go and to bear witness to something, and occasionally to flinch and to copy that flinch, to be in front of a model who is frightened and nervous and hungry and perfectly willing to take the money being offered to be in this painting, and to know that these are high-priced luxury goods for wealthy consumers populated by black and brown people. Oftentimes wanting to get that moment down perfectly about how uncomfortable they feel in that moment, about how we're all sort of trapped in this thing, and what is it? And I'm just trying my best to get this thing out there, to get it down. But in the end, I can't be responsible for a corrective. I don't know how to do that. All I know how to do is to be present and to be mindful of what's in front of me. And at its best, that's what you're looking at. The urge to make something that gets outside of the trappings of labels is even expressed by heterosexual white males, which was a breakthrough for me because I thought that it was an urge that was limited just to people of color or just to women or just to hyphenated peoples. And I think ultimately this naming game is what we do. I mean, it's a human urge to be able to say this is what that is. And it's what we do in order to survive and in order to thrive from generation to next. We tell stories, and those stories are what bind us, and we're all bound by these stories. And I'm, as a storyteller in some way, as an artist, I'm sort of bound by a narrative that precedes me. It's a vocabulary. I'm putting together sentences based on words that I inherit. And so I'm standing on all these, I'm standing on the shoulders of all of these artists, and I'm standing on the shoulders of art history, and it's incredibly suffocating to be able to look back to all these really talented and amazing artists in the past. So as opposed to trying to ignore the elephant in the living room, I start painting the elephant. And so art history itself becomes the muse. My own anxieties around being good enough to talk about this stuff becomes the muse. Even the fear of going to some place as impossible to get right as Israel, as subject, becomes the muse. And then you throw yourself in there, and then you figure out what comes out of it, and then you've got a show, right? There is no system. There's no state of grace where I'm ever going to be free of it, and I feel comfortable in that now, and I've learned to embrace that anxiety as my friend in the creative process. I feel actually most comfortable when I have something to throw myself up. What was it, Lorraine Hansberry? I feel most black when thrown up against a sharp white background.